Oh, nice. How really, really nice. And how actually really appropriate for what I'm going to try to do today, which is perhaps talk about 6 or 7 different things, in addition to a number of people who were significantly involved with Ananda Kumaraswamy. There are many that I am not speaking about. And in particular, he had important connections to major figures involved in theosophical concerns, both in Sri Lanka and in England. So what I have chosen today to do is for a museum audience, for people who are interested specifically in art, which very often, if not completely, is necessarily out of context. And this is one of the reasons that Ananda Kumaraswamy still very much matters to all of us, whether we're scholars or visitors or simply interested in the past. I begin, however, with, I suppose, a high point of some things to consider in terms of what he did not do. One of the significant aspects of studying the past and trying to understand, as Laura rather wonderfully put it, asking students, why is it we think like this? Because it's so hard to get out of those legacies, is to recognize what Kumaraswamy both did and what he didn't do, but not just what he didn't do, but why it matters. Why it matters is the part we are still, as art historians and scholars, trying to move forward. So this is not a litany of, well, omissions or shortcomings. There is a field that has developed in art history over the last 20 years looking at how art history has evolved. For that, Kumaraswamy matters, as he has now come to matter for the development of early modernism in the 20th century, for the development of Sri Lankan studies. He comes to matter very much, even to people who are not interested in art history or objects. And even in India itself, Kumaraswamy is a significant figure who talks not only about art, but the larger concerns of societies that produce art, and why we should all look at those materials, even if we are not part of those societies. So in terms of that which he does not engage, you have heard that I study Buddhist art especially, and it is the sensitivity of Buddhist material that actually first got me to go to Sri Lanka, a place I had long wanted to see. And what I came to realize is that although he had a great deal of wonderful first-hand experience at a wonderful time in the early 20th century, there were certain things he simply did not see or did not engage. So if you look at his copious writing, and believe me, it is copious, you will not see any discussion of the Buddhas like this image of a reclining figure, a figure of the Buddha in parinirvana or passing on into nirvana, that dot many sites in Sri Lanka today that are worshipped and significant for the major Buddhist population that still lives there. He saw these figures. He saw them being worshipped. He talked about certain aspects of their worship in the past, but actually engaging with contemporary ritual activity was not something that he found necessary to embrace. Thus, he would look at an image like this on the screen of a, again, gigantic Buddha image, which is carved out of stone, dating from probably the 12th century, and he might talk about it in terms of style and subject. But the people who were there worshiping the image were of little consequence in terms of his reception and thinking about the significance of the work. he was not exceptional for his time. This was the approach of looking at visual imagery. He did fight in incredible ways for the value of Sri Lankan material and Indian material, to raise the stakes as to their status as something more than just unfortunate religious depictions. But the holes in the way in which he approached this material were things that had reverberation for many decades throughout the 20th century. It is finally something that is beginning to be addressed by art historians who are interested in the context and changing circumstances in which images move, sometimes not always in the place where they were first created. Ananda Kumaraswamy begins his life in Sri Lanka, but at 2, he is taken by his English mother back to England, and when his father dies, they remain in England where he grows up, and essentially passes through university with a scientific emphasis. He finds himself with a job appointed in 1902 for a 4-year stint to establish the parameters of a new survey. The survey was not a geological survey for broad scientific interests. The survey, I am unfortunately able to acknowledge, was specifically in the interests of the empire. It was an extractive mode in which he moved through the island. He was looking for minerals and deposits of minerals that were significant enough to be valuable for the betterment of the British Empire. This is how he lived for 4 years, and it is these 4 years, from 1903 to 1907, in which he changed from a simple scientific bent to one which moved in a completely different direction. In 1907, he goes back to England, but he is no longer a scientist. He has committed himself to studying and writing and promoting the arts and cultures of South Asia, for which I should say Sri Lanka, as it was then called Ceylon, was conceived by him as simply part of India, so it was not identified as a completely separate tradition. You see on the screen the various images we can raise to show this trajectory from 1902 at the top through a photograph of him in Sri Lanka to his next incarnation, if you will, where he begins to collect Indian paintings in India itself, to finally 1917, when he comes here and to become the first curator of Indian art in America. Ananda Kumaraswamy has been studied by many people, and there is much really interesting information and perspective because of their studies. But he remains in some ways a conundrum. And I think in part it is difficult to pin a certain understanding upon him because of his lengthy career and its changing nature. So as you see in this photograph on the screen, which was taken by a well-known photographer, one of incredibly large importance for the development of modernist photographic concerns, Alvin Langdon Coburn, in 1916. It is at the same time that Coomaraswamy writes in certain places with disdain about contemporary art. But this would be too simple an approach to thinking about him. For at this time, as I will hopefully show you with some slides today, Coomaraswamy was charting a course through his life as a scholar that still embraced being very much involved in contemporary art. When he came to Boston, he had a formidable collection of material that he had amassed both in Sri Lanka and India, amongst which were a few small bronzes. And this particular figure that you see on the screen, you can go and look at in the gallery after the lecture. This small bronze is one of 3 that he collected in Sri Lanka, but never published until he began to write about the significance and the quality of Indian art. In other words, this was not part of what constitutes Coomaraswamy's first initial studies of visual material, which was particularly geared towards understanding arts and crafts. This figure, this small image, is a Buddhist image of the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, hence my interest, you can imagine, from the 8th century. It's an early small bronze. It is, however, quite small. It's from 4 inches in height. Nonetheless, Kumaraswamy repeatedly publishes this image, touting its qualities of craftsmanship as a way to move away from requiring images to be realistic. Instead, he wrote eloquently about the ways in which musculature and detail of costume are suppressed in order to express something higher aesthetically. It is in this way he begins, with this image, that he begins to chart a path towards understanding the quality of Indian art as something somehow different than what was often accepted and touted in the West, that is, works which were realistic. He set up a binary, however, that was really too simplistic, and it was especially too simplistic for understanding the early 20th century. This is another one of the problems that I have with Ananda Coomaraswamy, for his way of arguing and promoting Indian art or South Asian material was as something separate, something totally different from the realism that was for a very long time especially favored in the West. But in the West, in the early 20th century, as we all, I think, know, there were incredible questions about moving beyond just superficial resemblance. And it is in that group of people and thinkers that Indian art comes to be particularly important, to grow, in a sense, its significance, as Kumaraswamy is coming onto the stage to discuss exactly those points. He used this image and others from the 8th century, 2 of which he had collected in Sri Lanka, to argue against the prevailing emphasis by many, especially Western archaeologists, that often had posited these kind of stone images from the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century from the northwestern part of the subcontinent as somehow the high point of Indian art, and that what happened afterwards was simply less important, less significant. He, following another scholar and writer, E.B. Havel, actually pushed against this assumption, and he pushed so hard as to actually denigrate the very nature that these works could be very good Indian objects or examples of Indian art. In other words, as we study the past, we begin to see that its excesses or simplifications, for very good reasons, have sometimes unfortunate consequences. His emphasis on trying to move the bar of quality away from this material, which was usually touted for its supposed clear expression of Western influence from Greece and Rome. The consequences is that this material has been often very shortchanged and not thought about in terms of what is significant and creative. So it is this way, I think, we begin to find images like the Avalokiteshvara that is now in the MFA helpful to understand what Kumaraswamy was attempting to do in the early 20th century. It behooves us to not only peg his writing, but to come to terms with its effect in his arguments. He won the day. He was able to demonstrate by such images from the 8th century that indeed Indian art, or art from the subcontinent, was not ended in terms of quality in the 3rd or 4th centuries. Now, when we think about influences on Kumaraswamy, we have to consider not only what he collected when he was doing other kinds of work, and this was during the years that he collected information about mineral economies in Sri Lanka, but also who he talked to and who talked to him or showed him things. And it is that record that we have to acknowledge we will never completely collect. We have glimmers, and it is the glimmers and how we study them that I think will give us perhaps the way forward, to see him as someone who has exceedingly helped us open up certain kinds of arguments, but who at the same time accepted the idea of a canon of art as simply sculptures and paintings, much as the West had constituted it for a couple of hundred years, Western scholars. This is beside the fact that his own wife, Ethel Coomaraswamy, was somebody very interested in arts and crafts and in new technologies as well as new sciences. And one of the pleasures of working on Kumaraswamy has in fact been able to find out a great deal more about Ethel Coomaraswamy and her abilities. Here's an example of the photographic techniques. She was obviously gifted in terms of taking images and producing them. But she made these images as part of her scientific studies in England, studies which apparently were the ways in which the Kumaraswamys first got together, for this is how Ananda and Ethel first met. They married in 1902, and she continued to take photographs of particular formations throughout England, then studying with her husband, or now husband, Ananda Kumaraswamy. She continued to take photographs when she followed him or accompanied him to Sri Lanka in 1903 through 1907. And her photographs are found in his excavation reports identifying particular sites. They are much more than just scientific studies. One of the interesting things I have encountered in studying Kumaraswamy is that many of the assumptions about when he did things are wrong. And one of the assumptions is that he himself took up photography after Ethel and he divorced. But he, in fact, was an early practitioner of photographs, as these two works show. You can see from the images on the left, Ethel is included in a group of men who are studying certain geological formations on the northwest coast, I should say. And on the right is a photograph he took of Ethel when they went on their honeymoon to study in Scotland certain formations. This is before they went off to Sri Lanka. Ethel Coomaraswamy is of Ananda Kumar's 4 wives. That's right, 4. The best known, perhaps, by scholars because of her work with textiles. She has been studied by a number of individuals now since 1973, and some of those individuals have actually done a fair amount of defining her significance for Ananda Coomaraswamy's own development in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. She begins to do her own serious work with hand loom weaving upon their return from Sri Lanka. She herself has been affected by her experience in Sri Lanka. And one of the problems for both Ananda Kumaraswamy, or the study of him, and Ethel Coomaraswamy, is the way in which we can untangle them and also consider differently how, as different individuals, they were affected by their years in the subcontinent. Ethel went on to become very well known as the reviver of handloom weaving in England. Although their marriage did not continue past 1910, they eventually got an actual divorce in only 1912. She was permanently changed by her travel and living in Sri Lanka. And one of the great things many of us certainly are thrilled about after COVID is being able to travel again, to see different things. She was, however, even though Gandhi, for instance, came to see her when he visited England in the teens, she was adamant about the fact of not trying to borrow completely any designs from India or Sri Lanka, but instead to incorporate certain aspects of technique into her otherwise Western sensibilities. She's created, in other words, a third space, neither Indian or South Asian, nor Western, a way in which we can talk about true influence and sharing, and in my way of thinking, a true collaboration of why it matters for us to learn about other places. Ethel Coomaraswamy is most often talked about in terms of her hand weaving success. She is discussed in terms of being the first wife of Ananda Coomaraswamy. And usually there is some notice given to her success in teaching others to weave. She organized and operated a very successful weaving workshop. Less emphasized, however, so far, is the fact that at the end of her life, she was still emphasizing an aspect of their work together that they had carved out. And that is the way in which we are influenced when we encounter actual examples. If there's anything to celebrate as we sit here in a museum full of actual examples, I can't think beyond simply saying that. She was, and he was, a proponent of looking at good objects which would guide your own sensibility in development. And so, at the end of her life, one of the activities that Ethel Coomaraswamy in the 40s was involved in was not only advocating that weaving become part of the educational system of England, because this was not just an industrial aspect of her work that could then be parlayed into economic values, but that weaving and learning about weaving and alternative approaches to weaving were ways in which the mind and the ethical framework of one's identity could be improved. And because of her belief in such things, she actually produced kits like the ones that you see on the screen with actual samples of different kinds of weaving that are her interpretations of certain kinds of techniques, but they are not simply slavish copies of Indian techniques of handloom weaving, in order for students to be inspired locally as their teachers explained to them what they were looking at. These kits were available to be borrowed, like checking things out from the library. So if we think about Ananda Coomaraswamy, I'd like to say that one of the most important things we can consider is the way in which he emphasized quality of materials, of examples, as ways that could actually make a difference. And that when he railed, and he often did, against the certain kinds of publications that were becoming more and more frequent in the West about Indian art, he railed not against the bad photographs that were often found in these publications, but the choice of examples. And it's that choice that is the hardest to teach, except by looking at some materials which actually convey the quality of understanding. It is with that perspective about Kumaraswamy that we can see not just Ethel's influence upon him, for in fact, very likely, his whole interest in getting into collecting arts and crafts and writing about it in Sri Lanka came for her own previous interests, but also in their collective desire to operate in ways that, to some degree, paralleled a major philosophical concern of the arts and crafts movement. Now, speaking about a very different perspective, we can look at his second wife, a woman that he married in 1912, the woman he left Ethel for, a woman named Alice Richardson, who learned to sing in styles of Indian forms, and who eventually began to perform under the name Ratan Devi. It is Ratan Devi's performance schedule that actually brought her and Ananda first to America. And with his coming to sort of shepherd Ratan Devi through America and to actually introduce her performances with short lectures on the nature of Indian music, he began to think about the possibility of relocating here permanently with his now rather large collection of painting and textiles and arts, that is, sculptures and bronzes of India and Sri Lanka. He did eventually succeed in finding a home, and it was this home. In 1917, Denman Ross bought a fair portion of that collection, which now we have in the MFA as the Denman Ross collection, and Coomaraswamy came along with it. Here in this article, however, written for a broad audience, because this is an article that appeared in Vanity Fair, he is emphasizing the importance of music of India as becoming more and more popular and the ways in which we might be affected by it in a positive way. For he is, again, railing or, let's say, concerned that we, in some fashion, be able to judge that which we are seeing, even if it is strange. Alice Richardson was apparently a remarkable singer who was able to master the learning of Indian music, as we see here, and whose performances, as Ratan Devi, were given accolades in many different areas by many different kinds of audiences. She and Ananda developed a very successful tour that they then repeated in 1916. It is in this tour that Denman Ross brings Ananda Coomaraswamy here for his first lectures. Previous to their tour of America in 1915 and then 1916, they had published together. And I should have mentioned that this was an approach Ananda had developed already with Ethel to co-publish certain materials. Here you see the publication of 30 songs from the Punjab and Kashmir that are recorded by Ratan Devi and introduced briefly by Ananda Coomaraswamy with a foreword by no less than Rabindranath Tagore, who was in England in 1913 to receive the Nobel Prize. And we find here in this publication one of the rare acknowledgments of the sort of source material, which is through a particular Indian singer who, for a period of some months, actually taught Alice Richardson in Kashmir. We have in this publication from 1913 not only Alice's notations, Ananda's foreword, Ananda's introduction, but the foreword by Tagore, who, and I just go to the last paragraph, you can see to some degree the kind of trepidation he had about actually hearing an Englishwoman try to sing in an Indian manner, but apparently she was quite successful in communicating and moving beyond the divide. In other words, like Ethel Coomaraswamy, she was able to find that space that is neither east nor west, that does not just garble something foreign or stay only in her own tradition. And it was recognized by Tagore. Kumaraswamy himself, at the conclusion of the foreword, and that's what you see on the screen now, is somewhat philosophical about the future of Indian music, but he manages to notice that Indian music is the most important of the arts, and this may come as a surprise to a number of you who know him as somebody interested in visual art. But the most important of the arts, he affirms here in this publication, is actually music, to be treasured because it is under threat, as many of the traditions were. This is not actually just because of the empire. This is not just because there is less traditional patronage. This is an attitude that is found also about those areas that are declining traditionally in the West. And so right then, at the same time in England, folk music is being collected by English writers and musicians. So Kumaraswamy is, if we only look at him as an individual who's looking to India, seemingly more distinct than actually the impulse from which he is operating. He did, however, move in some ways in new, exciting avenues. And one of those was certainly the collecting of Indian paintings, for which he rightly deserves a great deal of appreciation for recognizing the qualities not only in finished works, and particularly ones of the Mughal dynasty that had been well studied to some degree earlier, but also in unfinished works and in drawings, because in the end, Kumaraswamy was actually rather amazingly interested in the acts of creation, in the practices of artists, things that he had first learned in his careful studies with Ethel in Sri Lanka. He not only collected this material, but he often and repeatedly, and I have to really underscore repeatedly, produced various publications with very little text, but highlighting exquisite examples of sculpture or painting, or, as he first started in 1910, in a volume of selected examples of Indian art. The emphasis, again, over and over, is not upon the fact that you need good photographs of material. You need instead to understand what you are looking at in terms of its quality, and that putting in front of audiences, particularly artists in the early 20th century in the West, of good quality examples would do a great deal to improve the world, not because they would slavishly copy Indian art, but because they would be able to be, in a sense, reviving their own traditions. This work in 1910 and 1913, 2 years in particular to highlight, is one that is also paralleled by interesting developments of other kinds of collaborations, or let's say conversations that he had with people of some significance, such as Roger Fry, who, as an artist and an art critic, was really an important individual, not only as an editor of a major periodical, for which then Kumaraswamy published quickly 5 articles over the next 6 years, but this other other individual you see represented here, Edward Gordon Craig, who launched certain kinds of theoretical explorations about modernist theater. So theater and visual material and music were combined in the explorations of Kumaraswamy in the 20th century. And we might see that his wives, or these individuals of Ethel Kumaraswamy and Alice Kumaraswamy, were individuals who participated in developing attitudes and understanding of that material. Now, Roger Fry is especially well known before coining the term post-impressionism. No, it's not actually something that the artists themselves at the time came up with. It was what Roger Fry determined could pull together a rather avant-garde representation for the first time in England for an English audience of very avant-garde art. This individual was also a friend of Ethel's and then of Alice Kumaraswamy. So these are the groups of people, I suppose we would call them networks these days, that we have to understand are the larger context of individuals looking into at Indian art in ways that are both to understand more specifically what was represented, but also the achievements that could be, in effect, not slavishly copied, but inspiration for the West. And we see that in Ananda Kumaraswamy's own writing for the Burlington magazine, for instance, in 1910, in this presentation of Indian bronzes, and most of them are not Indian, but actually Sri Lankan. One of the interesting facts that I've sort of gotten wrapped up in, that he's presenting works that people have not seen at all to the West. Not presenting them necessarily inaccurately, getting the identifications and dates amazingly well located, but not presenting them as works which are used in any kind of ritual. These are artworks. So these are the ways in which Indian art is defined by Ananda Kumaraswamy. And it is these works that serve as a kind of background, a kind of link to looking at the performing arts that he is also concerned with. So we see here Alice Richardson with someone who paired with someone who she sometimes performed with, a dancer who is also Western, who happened to have been born in India and learned Indian dance there, who were, as a couple or a group, a small group, were attempting to raise the quality of Indian representation and understanding for Western audience, and yet to make it, in a sense, perhaps not as foreign as it might have seemed. This is happening against, again, a larger context, and it's that larger context which gets so difficult for us to keep in the air or I suppose, embraced, because we're already trying to understand so much. But the larger context here is, again, that visual art is not only under questioning by the West and Western artists and thinkers, but all of the arts. So that, thinking of Stravinsky and his amazing Firebird score performed in 1910 was only a kind of opening for what became a scandalous production, or at least that's the way it was received in its premiere in 1913, The Rite of Spring. This production we can study through photographs, through the traces of the costumes, through the traces of the settings that were used. But we cannot completely get ourselves back there. We have to recognize, again, the void, the gap, I suppose, is better, that we live in terms of trying to understand what was significant and what might have reached out to someone like Ananda Kumaraswamy, who by the way, never wrote about the Rite of Spring. And yet it's hard to imagine, given the networks in which he operated, that he didn't know something about this notorious premier. He did, once he came to America, begin a relationship which culminated as his third wife. So by 1917, he and Alice are moving apart, even though they have two small children. And by 1922, he has his third marriage to a much younger woman who is a dancer. So it's a continuation of individuals who are, like him, exploring the parameters of the edges. This woman, Stella Bloch, he met in New York, and he met her during one of the rehearsals for Alice or Ratan Devi. Stella traveled with him before he had actually gotten his divorce from his second wife to the Indonesia and Southeast Asia, and she was particularly and always interested in dance. And so one of the things that she explored and was helped to explore with Coomaraswamy was actual experience studying for a very brief time dance in Indonesia and Bali, and producing in several ways material like this, a book about that dance form. She made drawings, and she eventually also in the 1920s began to make performances much along the line of Ratan Devi. She, however, divorced, or she initiated a divorce from Kumaraswamy in 1929, a brief marriage that she then, they both actually quickly remarried, and she went on to not perform Balinese or Indonesian dance, but instead the Charleston and other dances, moving out of the South into the sort of avant-garde New York scenes, and particularly, as she had also always been interested in art, became involved in making scenes, paintings of the Harlem Renaissance. She is still not well studied, and I think will, in the next years, probably begin to get real attention. But she was certainly channeling some of this experience of traveling in new ways and looking at new material and finding ways not to just copy it, but to, in a sense, renew it, but in a different place. She was a particular inspiration in a variety of ways for Coomaraswamy, for both photographs that he took of her and drawings that as a group were published and also exhibited in a particular place, a bookshop called the Sunwise Turn. And this is the last of the collaborators I want to highlight here, because this, in a way, is perhaps really the most remarkable. The Sunwise Turn was an initiative of a small independent bookstore started by two women. There were not a lot of these. It also had a very left-leaning agenda. It was a place where the two women, Madge Jennison and Mary Mowbray Clark, hoped to bring individuals into conversation with each other and particularly interesting books, but also they held regularly poetry readings as well as art exhibitions and lectures. And yes, Ananda Coomaraswamy was one of the lecturers as well as one of the exhibitors at their shop. They were not successful. Their bookshop did not exist beyond 1927. But for a period of a brief 10 years, from 1917 to 1927, the shop was a kind of center for a lot of people passing through New York City where it was located. Individuals like you see here, Mary Mowbray Clark and Beatrice Wood, who goes on to be an incredibly important ceramicist and was at that time involved with very avant-garde artists and collectors such as Marcel Duchamp, often frequented the place, and she even worked, that is, Beatrice Clark worked as an intern. Mary Mowbray Clark was an artist who herself simply wanted to find a new space for humanity. And the man that she was married to, John Mowbray Clark, felt similar, producing works of art that were meant to inspire new ways of thinking about artistic form. But probably John Mowbray Clark is most important for being one of the individuals who organized, again, an exhibition of contemporary art for the first time in a country. But in this case, it was for the United States. This is the infamous Armory Show of 1913. New Descending a Staircase by Marcel Duchamp is the scandalous image for the show, but there were many works by artists, especially from Europe, that had never been seen in America. So it is interesting to think of individuals who are promoting places and spaces where art and alternative notions of art can be seen and appreciated. These were not necessarily or always museums. We find that now museums today, more and more by their embrace of different traditions, are coming to terms with ways in which we as individuals can encounter not just the past, but other ways of seeing that wonderful idea of John Berger. And so we have John Mowbray Clark as a contemporary artist of the early 20th century, actually written about by Ananda Kumaraswamy, who himself turns his own sort of way away from contemporary art after his relationship with Stella Bloch ends. Although Stella was for a long time or a short time, I suppose, his model, and a figure who actually inspired his own investigations in photography, for which he's actually most famous not because of his own photographs, but because he brought the idea of photographs as art into museums, happening here in the MFA in the 1920s. He brought those works in of the well-known photographer Alfred Stieglitz, and also included in this enterprise, this exchange, some of his own work of Stella. So looking at Kumaraswamy along a kind of sequential line, if we talked about his wives, from Ethel to Alice to Stella, would be interesting and is interesting, no doubt, for all of their achievements and things that are yet to be found out, for the networks in which they appreciated, and for individuals for whom they knew and exchanged much, like Mary Mowbray Clark. But if we look at them not just of a type, but of actually evincing some similar interests, what seems to arise, it seems to me, foremost of importance, is the interest in pursuing the idea of understanding and quality, of understanding serious aesthetic achievement, whether it is art or music or dance, and achievement that we discern through actually looking at specific examples. It is for that I think Kumaraswamy deserves all of our attention in the past and in the future that he receives. For what he didn't do only allows us to understand the difficulties that he did raise up as concerns of the time in which he lived. And it is for that reason that thinking about these relationships, and there is much more that others are working on and will discover, is, I think, really significant. Our problem is to try and put that material together so that we simply don't chronicle it as this is what has happened, and move on. And I thank you.
Thank you so much, Janice, for that fascinating talk and look at these individuals. We have time for questions if there are a couple of them. So, and it's a small enough group that you could just stand up and speak. Or there is a microphone also. Does anybody have a question? There's one here.
I'm wondering, given Britain's close relationship with India, why he didn't move to the UK and why he came to America?
That's a really good question. It's one that's clear there were certain authority because of his activity, and this is a whole aspect of him I have not touched on, but he was really important for certain individuals that were working on Indian independence. And you can imagine what the British officials thought of that. It's both less and more important than is sometimes made. I think if it's put into context, we see that he's attempting to keep the empire from crushing in a sort of a flattening way, the traditions that are really losing out, and also self-rule. But he was, at the same time, when he was in Sri Lanka, not an advocate for any kind of modern processes. He was an advocate for people not giving up their traditional ways, which we all understand is right, but we still want to be able to make things better for our children, to find economic success. So it was a utopian vision very often rather than a political one. The writing was important for politicians. So he found it an uncomfortable place to be in England. And we also, something I didn't mention whatsoever and really should, is obviously the war. The World War I was a really different matter for people in Britain. People were imprisoned for not working, and he wrote about that war as a civil conflict of the British, if not, in fact, one of largely economic concerns. So you can imagine some of the reactions. There's also the very unfortunate issue of the bias that people had with, quote, mixed race individuals. So America seemed to be a place and that was more accommodating and broader, in which there were, and obviously in Boston, he found Boston and New York, between Mowbray Clark and the situation here, he found a great deal of interested individuals without quite the same baggage of the concerns of the British Empire.
I really liked the whole transnational art and culture scene that you constructed. But if you were to speculate how Kumaraswamy might have not gone in some of the directions he went into because of his marital relationships, one of them or all of them, just sort of freely and off the record, what do you think?
Meaning, if he hadn't had them?
Yeah, what did they do for him that all these other relationships you were talking about?
Yeah. By looking at them together, and thank you, Laura, for the occasion to do what was really difficult for me. I obviously did not even speak about the fourth wife. I should say that's another whole lecture that somebody should do about Donna Luisa and his time here in Boston and what happened and transpired here. But this period from 1903 to 1920 was a really interesting one for both the war, for suffragette issues, the economy issues, the empire, and for my own interest in why Sri Lanka mattered in a different way. And it took me a rather long time to understand, and I didn't speak about it here, but his first book, Medieval Sinhalese Art, which is dedicated to arts and crafts material, is a work unlike anything else he produces afterwards. And I duly believe that it is because of the presence of Ethel Coomaraswamy in the making of the detailed notes and the documentation, that work, which was so foundational for developing his career and his understanding, and which does have certain elements of him in it, was not something he could reproduce or was even interested in. And I think that's the kind of significance we can see when we start to look not just at what did he do. He did thank her, by the way, in this book's forward, for taking the photographs, which were over 1,000. Glass plate negative photographs are not easy to do anywhere. But he did not have her as a co-author, and it's one of those things that I cannot quite understand, except that this was, I think it morphed into a certain, I have traced this book in the way in which certain pieces of the writing, he moves as his away from the field notes. So it's something that gave him a way to understand quality because of the experience with her. And I firmly believe that this is the big difference for Kumaraswamy, who took on looking at late art and craft material that was already well accepted at the international exhibitions, this Kandyan art as it's called, which is still today really important in Sri Lanka for defining Sri Lankan art. It was already defined by the international exhibition circuit as the most significant of Sri Lankan material. So he takes that on with Ethel to understand it and to actually not just accept that anything it's called Kandyan is okay, but to define what is good about Kandyan material. It's that what is good that he takes on into quote-unquote fine art or sculpture and painting. So without that experience, I don't think he would be what he was. Without Sri Lanka, I don't think he would have been able to talk about Buddhist material as he did, for which there was a huge, huge interest in the West, and so that helped him, as well as a kind of curiosity in South Asia. I could go on and say the same thing about Ratan, Devi, and Stella, but I won't, except to say that they were examples of individuals that, you know, if he could have been, he would, I suppose, but they were examples of people who were able to learn from South Asia and to not just channel that learning into something else, but to actually create. So it's that way I kind of celebrate them as something just different than, you know, even collaborators, I suppose, and so quite the same. Is that good? No.
I think we should close now, but I just want to thank you once again for a fantastic lecture, and thank you all for being here today. And
thank you.
I think we need to give
I should say again, it's a privilege to be able to talk here in a museum for which obviously so much is so significant, that is not just of our time, but of the world, and that we learn from. At a moment, this weekend, as we've all tried to eat out perhaps, and found we can't because everyone's celebrating commencement, i.e. education.
Very good.
Thank you.